we've kind of ended in 1814, and we've got sort of another period here, probably between about 1814 and 1840. And this really has to do with the kind of growth and maturation of many of these colonies. And we know that towards the end of this period, particularly in the Canadas, less so in the Atlantic colonies, but certainly in the Canadas where most of the growth is taking place in terms of population, in terms of economic development and industrialization and all kinds of other things, we'll see that growth create kind of social, political, ethnic, religious kind of conflict, and kind of in the rebellions of Upper Canada and Lower Canada, and eventually in a report by Lord Durham in 1838. So continue on with sort of where I left off. If we're looking at economic development in this period, like I said, a lot of this is about developing an agriculture, developing places like Upper Canada as a kind of a wheat economy, a farming economy. Obviously the timber from cutting down forests to build those farms will be used in a whole range of ways. And I said before as well, in the Atlantic colonies, a lot of this is building and developing significant economies in places like Halifax, Saint John, and elsewhere. We're also starting to see, to be able to facilitate this trade as well. I mean, this is a period where we're moving out of a period where, of subsistence agriculture into agriculture that will now be marketed and traded with others. So there's increasing specialization in the economy. That will obviously come with the beginnings of industrialization, but even in terms of agriculture. And so, farmers will increasingly think about, trading their wheat for other things, trading their corn, trading a whole range of other things. And so we start to see for that to happen, there needs to be a whole range of infrastructure development, starting with things like roads, but also canals that are built in this period, the Lachine Canal, the Welland Canal, but also the arrival of things like banks and things like that, credit, and that to create a monetary economy, which really had not existed to any degree prior to the 1820s or 1830s. So we're starting to see this kind of modernization, or the emergence of what we might want to call a market economy or a capitalist economy. All of this, including industrialization, right, is really, really in the Canadas in its very, very infant form, right? Most people are engaged in primary industries, farming, timber perhaps in the winter, if you're in the Atlantic colonies, fishing and other and other primary industries. So that is it. But we're starting to see the growth of towns, eventually cities, and of course this will occur in many ways in the more established areas of the Canadas. And so it's why industrialization takes place in places like Montreal and Lower Canada before it will move elsewhere. Part of this also has to do with the end of land, because now it creates a surplus stock of labor who are then going to search for jobs. And obviously in the laws of economics, right, the more people who are searching for work, right, the price of that labor will go down. Okay. So economically, that's what we're sort of moving into. I'd say we're moving into a kind of more of a commercial market economy that we might identify in the modern period. The other thing driving this as well is tremendous immigration that comes largely from Great Britain. And so up and until 1814, between basically the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1814, the world had really been on fire, at war with one another. This does not create situations for immigration, but in the aftermath of that, Britain, had again excess population, was looking to send them to the colonies, not just Canada but Australia and elsewhere. We see a huge wave of people who come in from Britain. And again, Canada is seen as increasingly, or the colonies are seen increasingly as areas of opportunity, right? In the French regime, it was kind of seen as kind of a sentence of death. No one wants to go to Canada, it's cold. and Baron and all of those other kinds of things. But now this is seen as an opportunity. But it creates a number of social, ethnic, and religious tensions that are going on here, particularly in Lower Canada as Irish, Scottish, English arrive, right, with different religious backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, different cultures, and all those other kinds of things. But it'll also occur in many of the other colonies as well, particularly as we start to see, maybe more so as we get into the 1840s, but we're also starting to see in this period the arrival of Catholics from Ireland. And as we know, the tensions between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, and the tensions between Ireland and Great Britain would kind of carry on over into the colonies as well. But many of these late loyalists, many of these, again, going back to those original loyalists, right, had come from religious backgrounds that were not Anglican. They were Methodists, they were Baptists, they were Quakers and Mennonites and all kinds of other things. And so places like Upper Canada in particular, this became a grievance for many of them, because if we remember back to 1791 in the Constitutional Act, it made the Anglican Church the official church, official religion of the colony, but there were very few Anglicans. In fact, many of those even immigrating from Great Britain were again not necessarily Anglican. So they disliked this because it meant that the clergy reserves made it harder for them to settle to settle land. It meant that schooling was cut off and school funding was cut off to them, and they'd have to pay for their own schools and things like that. So there were all kinds of tensions that were going on. Okay. Other things that are also going on here. So 1817, we get the Rush-Bagot Treaty, Rush-Bagot Treaty, which kind of ends the kind of conflict between the United States and Great Britain, and particularly in North America, right? It forms that long, quote-unquote, undefended border. Now, of course, there'll still be some tensions, as we'll see in 1837, and then again during the Civil War. We also get a border convention which starts to establish things like the 49th parallel and other borders as more solid and recognized in this period. But again, Americans still tend to be crossing into Upper Canada, and some of this again in the War of 1812. Like I said, it created this wariness of Americans, right, certainly among the Upper Canadian elite, and there were all kinds of attempts to ban American immigrants or to reduce their rights. And so people like Robert Gourlay, who was a Scot, who came to the colonies, he believed that that immigration should be thrown wide open, the Americans should come in, that we should adopt more of the practices of land settlement and all the rest of that of the Americans, and he's promptly drummed out of the colony because his views were seen as kind of treasonous. But we also get this other thing known in the 1820s known as the alien question. And again, that had to do with trying to reduce the social and political rights of American immigrants. And so we get this battle in Upper Canada between those who kind of side more with these kind of older British notions of government and who have the kind of British pedigree, and those who see themselves as kind of North Americans. And who again want to adopt more of these kinds of American governmental practices, economic practices, social practices. Okay, so that continues on through the 1820s and leads into the 1830s. Now we get to the rebellions, and they occur largely in Upper Canada and Lower Canada. They're pretty much absent from the Atlantic colonies, although not to say that those colonies did not have similar grievances with the way that they were being governed by the British. But a lot of this then is tied up and goes all the way back to that Constitutional Act, that loggerheads between the elected assemblies, right, who wanted to sort of say we represent the people and we want to be able to have more control over government, and these appointed councils and governors who basically said, we know what's best, Father knows best, a very kind of patriarchal and paternalistic kind of ideas. Now, in Lower Canada, the reason why the conflict is more intense than it is in Upper Canada is because it takes on much, much heavier ethnic overtones. And that is those who surround the governor in Lower Canada, what becomes known as the Chateau clique, tend to be of Anglo-Irish Protestant backgrounds, and they are a distinct minority in the province or in the colony, but they do control important levers of the Quebec or the Lower Canadian economy out of Montreal. Many of them are these fabled Montreal merchants who are moving wheat and timber and all kinds of other things up and down the St. Lawrence and off over to the Empire. So it's seen as this kind of very small ethnic elite who are keeping the bulk of the population, who are French and Catholic, out of the rightful access to power that they think that they should have, right? Because they're the majority. They're being ruled by a minority. And so part of this, again, goes all the way back to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, other revolutions that will occur even in the 1820s and 1830s. Ideas that are going on in the United States about Jacksonian democracy and the right of kind of people to rise and fall based on their own merits. It doesn't matter about your birthright or who you know. It should be these ideas of kind of careers open to talent, right? This idea of kind of freedom, self-made men, right? And so that starts to come into play, I would say, largely in places like Upper Canada, being led by people like Mackenzie, William Lyon Mackenzie, who again is not American, he's a Scot, but he doesn't like the ruling elite in Upper Canada because he believes that they rule in the interests of too narrow a group that again forms around the governor and these appointed officials in the executive and legislative councils. And so you start to see people like Mackenzie, but also Robert Baldwin, who might be a little bit more of maybe what I want to call moderate in that regard, who start to advocate for things known as responsible government, right? And so the government will be more responsible to the population, to the people, and a wider group of people than currently was taking place. And in 1837, a lot of this kind of explodes into these rebellions. Part of it is due to disruptions in the economy in 1837, this growing group of landless people in Lower Canada and in Upper Canada who view their futures as something that is, it kind of scares them, right? That they don't know where this new economy is going. And they view themselves as perhaps being cut out of it. Again, some of these things are about religious tensions, ethnic tensions, social tensions. Immigration from Great Britain, particularly in the 1830s, leads Lower Canadians to believe that they are going to be flooded out by British immigrants. Many of these British immigrants arrive bringing things like cholera and all the rest of that. And they're worried about all of that. So we get rebellions in 1837 in the Canadas. In Lower Canada, like I said, much more intense. Upper Canada, less so. We know in some ways the Upper Canadian Rebellion in muddy old York in 1837 is a bit of a comedy of errors. And essentially Mackenzie and Papineau flee, and the rebellions are met with the stiff arm of the law by the British. The British send troops, particularly in Lower Canada, put it under martial law for a couple of years. But in 1838, they send over a guy named Lord Durham, who was known as kind of Radical Jack, and that was largely because he had supported doing things like widening the availability of votes to the British electorate, which was very, very narrow until the 1820s, 1830s. Probably no more than about 10%, 15% of the population in Britain could vote in elections to the House of Parliament, and he supported widening that. And so he'd send over basically to say, okay, the plan that we had in 1791, why doesn't it work? Right? We're going to have to then reassess this. We thought we had it right in 1791 with these legislative councils and more power to the governors and less power to the assemblies, but look, it's led to another rebellion. And so Lord Durham comes over and he proposes two things. The first thing he proposes is an act of union, and that is to draw the Canadas, as many colonies in the Canadas, including the Atlantic colonies as well, but it's unlikely that that's going to happen. It's probably going to be too unwieldy. But certainly Upper and Lower Canada drawn into a union in a single Canadian Parliament. And that was largely because he believed that French Canadians were backward. And that was kind of the reason why they blocked all of this legislation in the 1830s. And what they needed to be done was to kind of overwhelm them with English votes, which would largely come from Upper Canada, which was growing by leaps and bounds over that period. So he proposes this active union that basically to kind of assimilate French Canadians and to stop them from perhaps interfering which he saw in these kind of plans of pro-British politicians. The other idea he comes up with is this idea of responsible government. And that is that the government in the colonies will be more responsible to the electorate, or certainly by proxy, and much in the same way that our political system works today, right? The cabinet or the government that sits in power has to obtain enough votes in the House of Commons to pass its legislation. When it can't, that government is dissolved and we go back to new elections, or a new government is offered the chance to govern. And so Durham proposes this and says essentially, right, that the assembly should have more power, that the governor should draw into his cabinet or his executive councils those who have the confidence of the House, confidence of the Assembly, and therefore it'll be more responsible to the Assembly, more responsible to the elected Assembly, and by sort of extension, more responsible to the people. Now, in 1840, Durham doesn't last. He gets sick. He goes home. And barely finishes his report before he passes. So all we get in 1840 is this notion of an active union. Responsible government is not given right away because there's this notion that the empire, the British form of government is very, very hierarchical, right? You can't be responsible to two people at the same point in time, right? You can't be responsible to the Crown in England and responsible to the people, to the electorate. We can only have one line of responsibility. And so the British deny that. But they do institute this active union, which basically brings together the Canadas, Lower Canada, Upper Canada, Canada East, Canada West, into a single colony. Both sides are given the same number of seats, 40 for each side. That initially favors Upper Canada because in 1840 it actually has a slightly smaller population than Lower Canada. And it's believed then that all of the votes from Upper Canada plus the small number of Anglo-Scottish Irish in Lower Canada would largely vote as a bloc, and they would overwhelm French Canadians. French Canadians were encouraged to give up their language, to give up their religion, to give up things like the seigneurial system and all of that. So that kind of ends that period.
Go ahead.